How dare you show your face here? My daughter-in-law Ruth screamed at me across my son's casket, her perfectly applied makeup finally cracking. This is all your fault. If you had just signed over that worthless land when William begged you to, he'd still be alive. Every head in the cemetery turned toward us. I felt the stares, the whispers starting. Ruth's face was twisted with rage, nothing like the grieving widow she'd been playing all week. Those men came after him because of your stubbornness. You killed my husband. I was too shocked to respond. This woman who'd been dabbing her eyes with tissues that never seemed to get wet was now pointing her finger in my face, screaming accusations that made my blood run cold. The other mourners were backing away, uncomfortable with this public breakdown. That's when my phone buzzed. I glanced down, and the world tilted sideways. The text was from an unknown number. Mom, it's me. I'm alive. Don't trust Ruth. She's not who you think she is. I looked up at Ruth, who was still ranting about my selfishness, and suddenly I saw something different in her eyes. Not grief, not even anger. It was fear. She was terrified I might figure something out. Either someone was playing the cruelest joke imaginable on a grieving mother, or my son, who I'd just watched them lower into the ground 20 minutes ago, was somehow still breathing. And the woman screaming at me over his grave might be the reason he had to disappear. But before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you this. If you received a text from someone claiming to be your dead child, what would you do? Would you believe it? Or would you think someone was trying to drive you insane? Leave your answer in the comments below. I'm curious to know how you'd handle something this impossible. And if you want to hear the rest of this unbelievable story, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because what I discovered about Ruth and that worthless land changed everything I thought I knew about my own life. Now let me back up and tell you how we got to this point. Let me back up and tell you how we got here. I'm Hannah James, and I taught 3rd grade in Millfield, Colorado for 38 years. After my husband left us when William was just starting high school, just packed up one day and moved to California with his secretary, I was left with practically nothing. During our divorce, that snake of a lawyer he hired made sure he kept the house, the savings, everything that mattered. But there was this one piece of property. 160 acres of rocky, seemingly worthless land outside town that he'd bought in the early 80s as some kind of get-rich-quick investment scheme. When it never panned out, he was happy to dump it on me instead of paying proper alimony. "Take the land, Hannah," he said with that smirk I'd grown to hate. "Maybe you can grow something on those rocks." His lawyer laughed. Mine just shrugged and said at least it was something. So there I was, a single mother with a teenager, working summer jobs and tutoring kids after school, just to pay the property taxes on land I couldn't afford to develop and couldn't find anyone to buy. I was determined that William would never abandon anyone the way his father abandoned us. That worthless patch of Colorado dirt became our home, and William grew up helping me scrape together enough money to keep it. William grew up shy, trusting, maybe too kind for his own good. He became an accountant, quiet and dependable. At 35, he was still single, still living in the old farmhouse on our property, helping me manage the land I could never afford to develop. For years, it was just us against the world. William would come home from work and help me fix whatever was broken that week. The fence, the roof, the old well pump. We were poor, but we were happy. We had each other, and we had our little piece of land that nobody else wanted. Then 18 months ago, everything changed. William met Ruth at some business conference in Denver. She was everything he wasn't, confident, glamorous, from the city. She had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room when she talked to you. She swept him off his feet faster than I'd ever seen. My quiet, careful son was suddenly talking about fancy restaurants and weekend trips to Aspen. Within 6 months, they were married in a courthouse ceremony that I barely heard about until it was over. I should have known something was wrong when she didn't want a real wedding. When she brushed off my attempts to get to know her family. when she looked at our old farmhouse like it was something she'd stepped in. But William was so happy. For the first time in his life, he seemed confident, excited about the future. How could I tell him that something about his new wife made my skin crawl? Ruth moved into the farmhouse immediately, and suddenly, William was full of big ideas. She'd convinced him we were sitting on a gold mine, that the property could be developed, that we just needed the right investors to make it happen. "Hannah, you have no idea what you're sitting on," she told me one evening, spreading papers across our old kitchen table. "This land has so much potential. William and I have been talking to some very successful people who see the vision." I was skeptical, but William was so excited. He said Ruth had connections, investment opportunities that could set us up for life. All we needed was startup capital. Within weeks, William started taking out loans against the property, liquidating his savings, even borrowing against his future earnings. I watched my careful, cautious son turn into someone I didn't recognize. He was staying up all night on phone calls about investment portfolios and development opportunities. I'd hear him whispering into the phone at 2 a.m, using words he'd never used before: hedge funds, leverage, market positioning. When I'd ask questions, Ruth would interrupt with technical jargon that made me feel stupid. "Well, Hannah, it's complicated. You wouldn't understand the intricacies of modern investment strategies," she'd say with that condescending smile. "This is why William handles our finances now." Our finances. Like she'd been part of our family for decades instead of months. Then the bills started coming. Credit cards I didn't know William had. Loan payments that made no sense. When I confronted him, he seemed genuinely confused, like he couldn't remember signing for half of it. "I thought we only had one business loan," he'd say, staring at a credit card statement. "Ruth handles most of the paperwork. She's better with numbers than I am." Better with numbers than an accountant? That should have been my first red flag. But every time I tried to talk to William alone, Ruth would appear. She had this way of hovering, always listening, always managing the conversation. The William I'd raised would never have made financial decisions without talking to me first. But this new William, Ruth's William, was taking risks that terrified me. And when I tried to express my concerns, she'd make me feel like an overprotective mother who didn't want her son to succeed. 6 months after the wedding, William looked terrible. Thin, exhausted, constantly anxious. I barely recognized my son anymore. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and he had these dark circles under his eyes that made him look like he hadn't slept in weeks. One evening, he came to me with tears streaming down his face. He told me the investments had gone wrong, that they owed money to some very dangerous people. $2.5 million. I couldn't believe it. "William, how is that even possible?" He broke down crying like he was 8 years old again. "I don't know, Mom. Ruth handled most of it. She said I signed things, but I don't remember. The investors aren't regular banks. They want the land as collateral. If we can't pay, they'll take everything." My heart shattered, watching my grown son sob at my kitchen table. This was the boy I'd raised to be careful with money, who used to save his allowance for months just to buy me a birthday present. How had he gotten involved with $2.5 million in debt? That's when I started getting the phone calls. Men with rough voices asking about William's debt, and whether I understood what happened to people who didn't pay what they owed. They knew where I lived, where I shopped, what time I went to church. "Mrs. James," one of them said, his voice cold as ice, "your boy owes us money, a lot of money. We know you have that land. It would be a shame if something happened to you both because of his poor choices." I was terrified, but I was also angry. How dare these people threaten an old woman and her son over investments that made no sense? Ruth suggested we transfer the property deed to her name temporarily, for protection. She said her family had lawyers who could shield assets from creditors, that it was a common practice in situations like ours. "It's just paperwork, Hannah," she insisted. "Once this blows over, we'll transfer it back. But right now, having it in my name protects all of us." William begged me to trust her. He was so scared, so desperate. But against every instinct, I said no. Now here's my question for you. Have you ever had someone try to pressure you into signing over something valuable when you were scared or vulnerable? Let me know in the comments, because what happened next will show you exactly why I should have trusted those instincts. And if you're finding this story as shocking as I did when I lived it, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what Ruth was really planning. Because the truth about those threats was about to get much darker. 2 weeks ago, everything escalated. William called me at 3 a.m, whispering, "Mom, they're here. They found me. I have to disappear or they'll kill both of us." His voice was shaking with terror. I could hear car doors slamming in the background, footsteps on gravel. "William, what's happening? Where are you?" "I can't explain now. Just know that I love you, and whatever happens next, don't trust." The line went dead. I called back immediately, straight to voicemail. I called Ruth. No answer. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, pacing my kitchen, calling William's phone over and over until the sun came up. The next morning, Ruth called, hysterical. William had been in a car accident on Highway 40. Ran off the road into Miller's Creek during the storm. The car was found wrapped around a tree, but the body was swept away by the current. The sheriff said sometimes bodies never surface in those flash floods, especially with all the rain we'd been having. I was devastated. My son, my only child, was gone. I blamed myself for not signing over the land, for not protecting him from those dangerous people. The guilt was eating me alive. But something felt off. Ruth seemed to recover from her grief awfully quickly. While I could barely function, she was immediately talking to lawyers about settling William's debts, about selling the property to honor his wishes and pay off the criminals. "We have to be practical, Hannah," she said just 3 days after the accident. "William wouldn't want us to suffer because of his mistakes. If we sell the land, we can pay off his debts and move on with our lives." Move on with our lives? My son had been dead for 72 hours, and she was already making plans. Then came the funeral, and Ruth's explosive breakdown at the cemetery. And now I was getting these impossible texts. "Mom, I had to fake my death. Ruth planned this whole thing. She married me to get to your land. There's something valuable on that property, something worth millions that she's known about all along." I stared at my phone, my hands shaking. Another message came through. "The accident was staged. I'm hiding, but I need you to be careful. Ruth isn't who she says she is, and those men threatening us, they're working with her." My mind was reeling. If William was alive, then everything Ruth had told me was a lie. The grief, the funeral arrangements, the urgent need to sell the land, it was all an act. But how could someone fake their own death? And what could possibly be valuable about 160 acres of rocky Colorado dirt that my ex-husband couldn't even give away? I raced home from the funeral and started digging through old papers. I was desperate to find any clue about what William meant. What could possibly be valuable about our land? I searched through boxes I hadn't touched in years, old files, anything that might give me answers. That's when I found them. Geological surveys from the 1990s that I'd never seen before, hidden in William's desk drawer behind his tax returns. I pulled them out with trembling hands and tried to make sense of the technical language. Natural gas reserves. Massive ones. The kind that could be worth tens of millions of dollars. I sat there staring at those papers, my mind spinning. This whole time, while I was struggling to pay property taxes on worthless land, we'd been sitting on a fortune. No wonder Ruth had been so interested in developing the property. No wonder she'd pushed so hard for me to sign over the deed. My phone rang, making me jump. It was Paul Andrew. I'd taught him in 3rd grade, and now he was a lawyer in Denver. I'd called him earlier in a panic, asking if he could help me understand what was happening. "Mrs. James, I got your message. William contacted me yesterday. He's alive, and he's in hiding." I nearly dropped the phone. "Paul, is this real? Are these texts actually from William?" "It's him, Mrs. James. He's scared, but he's safe for now. He asked me to explain everything to you." Paul's voice was grim as he laid out the truth. Ruth had researched our family, found out about the potential gas reserves through some shady mineral rights company. The fake investments, the debts to criminals, it was all designed to force us to sell the land far below its value. She's been planning this for over 2 years, Mrs. James. She targeted William specifically because he was single, trusting, and had access to valuable property. The men threatening you aren't just random criminals. They're part of Ruth's scheme. My blood ran cold. You're telling me she married my son just to steal our land? That's exactly what I'm telling you, and she needed William gone, because he was starting to ask too many questions about where all that borrowed money really went. When he started getting suspicious, she had to eliminate him from the equation. I thought about William's confused face when he looked at those credit card bills, his genuine bewilderment about debts he couldn't remember taking on. Ruth had been drugging him, manipulating him, stealing his identity to rack up fake debts that would justify taking our property. Paul, I said, my voice shaking with rage, what do we do now? Paul and I worked out a plan. If Ruth wanted the land, we'd give it to her, but not the way she expected. We're going to trap her with her own greed, Paul explained. But you'll have to be convincing, Mrs. James. She can't suspect anything. I took a deep breath and called Ruth, forcing myself to sound like a broken old woman who just wanted the nightmare to end. Ruth, I can't take the threats anymore. These men keep calling, and I'm terrified they're going to hurt me. I'll sign over the property. I just want William's debts to go away so I can grieve in peace. She tried to sound reluctant, but I could hear the excitement creeping into her voice. Oh, Hannah, I hate that it's come to this. I know how much that land means to you, but if it's the only way to keep us both safe? Safe. The word made my stomach turn, knowing what I now knew about her. I just want this nightmare to be over, I continued, putting a tremor in my voice. William's gone, and I can't handle the stress anymore. Maybe you're right. Maybe selling is the only way. We'll take care of everything, she said, and I could practically hear her smiling through the phone. I'll contact the buyers and set up the paperwork. We can have this resolved quickly. We arranged to meet at Murphy's Diner on Route 6 the next day, a public place with lots of witnesses. I suggested it, claiming I felt safer meeting somewhere with other people around. Ruth agreed immediately, probably thinking she had nothing to hide. What she didn't know was that Paul was preparing very special documents. They looked like standard property transfer papers, but hidden in the legal language were confession clauses, admissions of fraud that would become legally binding the moment Ruth and her associates signed them. These papers will essentially make them confess to conspiracy, fraud, and extortion, Paul explained as he worked late into the night. Once they sign, they'll have legally admitted to every crime they've committed. It was risky. If Ruth read the documents too carefully, she might catch on. But Paul was betting on her arrogance, her assumption that a retired teacher and her former student couldn't possibly outsmart a criminal mastermind like her. I spent that night practicing my performance in the mirror, making sure I could play the part of a defeated old woman ready to give up everything. Because tomorrow, Ruth was about to find out that underestimating a third-grade teacher was the biggest mistake of her criminal career. At the diner, Ruth arrived with 3 men I didn't recognize, the same rough voices from those threatening phone calls. The moment she walked in, I could see she'd dropped all pretense. No more fake sympathy or widow's grief. This was the real Ruth, cold and calculating. Let's get this over with, she said, barely looking at me as she slid into the booth. I have the papers ready. Just sign where I've marked, and this whole mess will be behind us. I played my part perfectly, my hands shaking as I reached for the pen. I just want to feel safe again, I whispered. Those phone calls, I can't take it anymore. One of the men laughed. Smart choice, old lady. You wouldn't have liked what came next. As they started signing the papers, one of the men got impatient. This old lady better not be trying anything clever. We've invested too much in this setup to have it fall apart now. Ruth shushed him sharply, but it was too late. Don't worry about her. She's just a retired teacher. She has no idea what this land is really worth or how long we've been planning this. 2 years of research, another man bragged. Finding the right mark, getting the geological surveys, setting up the fake investment scheme. This score's gonna set us up for life. I kept my face blank, but inside, I was celebrating. They were confessing to everything, laying out their entire criminal operation right there in Murphy's Diner. What they didn't know was that Paul had been recording everything from his car in the parking lot, and Sheriff Stephen Criss, another former student of mine, had been listening to the whole conversation through a wire I was wearing under my coat. Ruth signed the last page with a flourish. There. Hannah, you've made the right choice. Within a week, those men will stop bothering you, and you can move on with your life. But as her pen lifted from the paper, she'd just signed a legal confession to fraud, conspiracy, extortion, and attempted murder. Here's my question for you. Have you ever had to pretend to be someone you're not, to protect yourself, or someone you love? Because what happened next required every ounce of acting ability I'd learned from 38 years of dealing with difficult parents and school board meetings. If you want to see how a retired teacher took down an entire criminal network, make sure you subscribe, because the next part is going to blow your mind. The moment the last signature went on the papers, Sheriff Stephen Criss and his deputies surrounded the diner. Nobody move. You're all under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, and attempted murder. Ruth's face went white as a sheet. She looked around frantically as armed officers filled every exit. What are you talking about? We're just conducting a legal property transfer. A property transfer that includes signed confessions to multiple felonies, Paul said, walking in with the recording equipment held high. Did you really think a woman who taught school for 38 years wouldn't know how to do her homework? I stood up slowly, pulling the wire from under my coat. You made one fatal mistake, Ruth. You underestimated a teacher. Her mouth fell open as she realized what had happened. You can't. This is entrapment. Actually, Sheriff Stephen Criss said with a grin, this is justice. Hannah, you can take that wire off now. We got everything we needed. Ruth's associates tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The entire diner was surrounded. As they handcuffed her, Ruth turned to me with pure hatred in her eyes. You have no idea what you've just done, she hissed. I know exactly what I've done, I replied calmly. I've saved my son's life and stopped you from destroying other families. The investigation that followed uncovered everything. The fake investment scheme, the staged debts, connections to similar scams targeting elderly property owners across 6 states. Ruth's operation had been running for over 5 years, targeting vulnerable seniors and stealing their most valuable assets. They recovered over $40 million in stolen assets and helped dozens of other victims. Families who thought they'd lost everything to medical debt or investment scams discovered they'd been targeted by the same criminal network. The FBI found Ruth's real identity. She wasn't even her real name. She was part of an organized crime ring that specialized in marriage fraud and property theft. William was just one of many victims, but he was the first one brave enough to fake his death and help bring them down. As I watched them load Ruth into the police car, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and relief. My quiet little town would never be the same, but justice had been served. And somewhere safe, my son was finally free to come home. William came out of hiding the day after the arrests. When I saw him walking up the driveway, I broke down crying. He was thinner, scared, but alive. He collapsed into my arms. Mom, I'm so sorry I put you through this. He explained everything. Ruth had been drugging his coffee for months, making him confused and compliant. When he finally realized what was happening, he had to choose between confronting her and probably getting killed, or disappearing and letting me handle it. I knew if anyone could outsmart them, it would be you, Mom. You always were the toughest teacher in school. The fake death had been his idea. He'd staged the car accident with help from Paul to make Ruth reveal her true plan. I hated putting you through that grief, William said, tears in his eyes. But it was the only way. We're developing the natural gas reserves now, responsibly, with proper environmental oversight. The money will set us up for life, but more importantly, William's safe. He's getting therapy, rebuilding his confidence, learning to trust his own judgment again. Ruth underestimated me, because I was just a retired teacher from a small town. But here's what 38 years in a classroom teaches you: how to spot a liar, how to do your research, and how to protect the people you love from bullies. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad. It's getting smart. And if this story taught you that you should never underestimate anyone based on their age or profession, make sure to subscribe for more incredible true stories. Because sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary things.